Good morning. I'm here to talk today a little bit about EQ or emotional intelligence. I've been thinking about this the last few days because, well, I listened to a podcast called No Stupid Questions by Angela Duckworth. It's a great podcast. I'd recommend it. They focused on EQ and how necessary EQ is to a leader's success. I was also recently told by a leader or by a supervisor, that there are two things that leaders need to be successful. They need high EQ, sorry, and they also need strategy or strategic thinking. And so I've been thinking a lot about EQ, and I've even wondered if my EQ is that strong. After listening to the podcast, I do believe that I've got pretty strong EQ. I think I would score well on one of those EQ measures that they have out there. Sometimes I don't always utilize my EQ, which is kind of interesting because they talked about leaders who are successful without high EQ, or at least individuals who might be perceived as having a lower EQ because of some of their techniques. But then the question came up, well, maybe they have high EQ, but they just don't use it, or they don't always, apply it in their leadership settings or in certain settings. But anyway, I've been wondering about EQ, and I do think it's important. I think it's important in education. It's a highly interpersonal field, and so we need EQ to be able to communicate well with each other and with community. So I do think that we should be working on EQ in schools, and I think teachers need high levels of EQ, and I'm not sure that that's always the case in schools, which is why we might see somebody burst out in tears because of some data that we're looking at in PLCs, or we might see a teacher run out of a classroom because they have had their feelings hurt by their students and just can't take it anymore. I also think that, if we build EQ, then that means that teachers will have more resiliency for some of the challenges that we face in education. It is a hard job, and it's not going to be easier necessarily. I also think that, we have EQ needs in education. And they talked about this on the podcast, that there are certain fields, certain careers that maybe require a higher level of EQ versus a lower level of EQ for other careers, like maybe being a data analyst requires a little less EQ. In fact, I think that might be beneficial, right? If you can kind of like not utilize emotion in looking at data. And so I'm wondering if we're when we're looking at data in PLCs, a task that doesn't require high EQ, if maybe our emotions are getting in the way during that task. And I mean, I don't have any kind of an answer to that. That's just something that I've been wondering about because we've been looking at data, and I know how emotionally stressful that can be for teachers when we're looking at data that isn't necessarily favorable. So EQ, yeah, something to think a little bit more about, something to explore a little bit more. I don't have the answers, obviously, but it's just something that I have been thinking about, wondering about. How does EQ impact the work that I do? How does EQ impact the work that teachers do? What is the EQ of a teacher? And how does that impact their work with students and during PLCs? These are just some questions that I have. I'd love to hear your thoughts, or I'd love to maybe explore these topics a little bit more and report back. So thanks for listening today. We'll see you soon.